Welcome everybody to today's session on Co-Requisite English, Co-Requisite English Professional Development. Today we are going to be focusing on the assessment of Co-Requisite English course SLOs. We are still admitting people and we're going to give people a couple minutes to do that, but I want to make a couple announcements before we do that. You'll notice that we are already recording the session. That has more to do with some editing, so we will edit these first minutes out. We would encourage you to stay on camera, but we do want to give you the option when you're being recorded, whether you want to be on camera or if you prefer to have your screen off. We will be breaking into breakout sessions twice during the session today. That's going to be led by Jane and Russell. During the breakout sessions, we will pause the recording because we want people to have candid conversations. And so we would encourage you strongly at that point to put your cameras back on. So we did want to let you know. We also want to let you know that we have the closed captioning on, and we do that for multiple reasons, including accessibility. You should be able to turn that on and off on your individual screen at the bottom. Additionally, during today's session, you can certainly watch it in gallery view or speaker view. Our recommendation is to watch it in speaker view. We will be spotlighting the speakers. Makes it a little bit easier to watch in that way. So with that, I want to give people the warning that this is probably going to be the point where we are going to be editing. And we will start the official. So welcome everybody to today's session. We're thrilled to have you here. This is the Nevada Co-Requisite English Professional Development Series, and today's session is focusing on the assessment of the Co-Requisite English course SLOs. It's going to be presented by Jane Detweiler from UNR and Russell Stern also from UNR, and I think you're in for a really good session because we're having folks from our own system. And speaking of the NSHE system, I do want to be sure to introduce Crystal Abba. She's the Vice Chancellor for Academic and Student Affairs, and she's going to give an initial welcome to everybody. Crystal?
Good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to just take the opportunity to briefly welcome everyone on behalf of myself, the Chancellor, and the Board of Regents, and also to thank the participants, and particularly Jane and Russell, for their presentations today. And of course, it goes without saying, but thanking Brandon and Complete College America for their ongoing support in these webinars. It reminds me of a quote from Robert Louis Stevenson, who said, "Don't judge each day by the harvest that you reap, but by the seeds that you plant." And I think that these webinars are about planting seeds through your good work and the preparation for full-scale implementation of co-requisite instruction. I continue to be amazed at the community of support created through these ongoing webinars, and it is a testament to your dedication to student success. So thank you all for your good work. So let's get to it. Back to you, Brandon. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Crystal. I've said it before, but I'm going to say it again. It really means a lot when you have the Vice Chancellor and all of NSHE supporting this work. The way that this professional development series was brought about was through, in this case, the English Co-Requisite Task Force, who identified not only the topics, but also the individual presenters. They said, this is who we need for successful implementation of co-requisite support, as we know that's coming in the next academic year. And so that says a lot to have the support from NSHE. As Crystal said, I'm representing Complete College America. My name is Brandon Protas, and I'm the Strategy Director here. I always want to start off talking about our mission and vision, because it's central to what we do. We have a singular focus, and that is increasing college completion rates while closing institutional performance gaps. Well, there's the word "and" in there. We see it as one, because you can't do one without the other. And when we say institutional performance gaps, we use that instead of either achievement or equity gaps, because rather than putting that onus for that change on students, we know that that change comes about, and you see it in our vision, through institutions, through policy, through our systems of higher education, when we make the changes that have impacts on student success. Co-requisite support is one of those strategies that we know makes a significant difference in student success rates. Complete College America is known for having game changer strategies, and we've expanded this into 4 pillars. You'll see: purpose, momentum, structure, and support. I'm not going to go through all of them. I do want to point out that co-requisite support, and it's often tied to things like multiple measures. That's one of our key strategies. It's been one of our strategies that we've been probably most known for when we first made that call almost a decade ago. Just to let you know, we have a new publication coming out in the next several weeks on co-requisite support that makes the case even more. But when we've seen states who've gone to scale, they've seen doubling and tripling of pass rates, not of the co-requisite course, of that too, but of the college level course. So we applaud what you are doing in Nevada. I know you're in front of a computer because we're in a virtual world, so you can go right now to completecollege.org. We'll drop the link in the chat, and you can create a profile by signing up. You'll, for example, get a copy of that report when it comes out. You'll be able to connect with some of our content experts, have a lot of resources. So we encourage you to be able to do that. We will also drop a link into the chat for the NSHE co-requisite website. It's a great resource that Renee Davis is making sure is up to date, where you can find the latest from NSHE as well as resources from the past. We'll remind you that today's professional development is part of a series. So while today you're going to be hearing about the assessment for SLOs, we have another session tomorrow, which is going to be on access for students with disabilities, and 2 more in April. We're actually looking at adding an additional topic to do online instruction part 2. You also see the past sessions, and on that NSHE co-requisite website and on the YouTube page that Renee will drop in the chat, you will be able to find recordings of past sessions. And so it's important whether you miss one or if you have colleagues who could benefit. We know it takes a lot of work to be able to move to co-requisite scale, and Nevada's doing it right. With that, I am going to turn it over to our presenters, Jane and Russell.
Welcome. Welcome to our workshop on assessing co-requisite first-year writing, and thank you all for joining us. As Brandon mentioned, I'm Jane Detweiler, and I direct UNR's Writing and Speaking Initiative. As the title suggests, I spend most of my time working with faculty and departments across the disciplines as they strengthen communication instruction in general education courses and in their degree programs. In the past, I've also served as the director of the first-year writing program, conducted a few assessment projects there, and as associate dean responsible for curriculum and assessment. Beyond these administrative positions, I've also conducted research on writing in the disciplines, writing program administration, and writing assessment.
And good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for coming today, and we look forward to the conversation. My name is Russell Stone. I serve at UNR as the Assistant Vice Provost for Accreditation and Assessment. And besides the 2 areas covered in that title, I oversee a number of initiatives that bridge academic and faculty affairs, as well as engagement. So I'll be working with you today, primarily from an administrative perspective. My doctoral degree is in literature. I taught writing intensive courses at UCLA for several years before coming up here to teach core humanities courses for several more years. So writing, instruction, and assessment are of particular interest to me as well. Brandon, would you please advance to the next slide?
I will, and just a quick note, I did put it in the chat, but if people have questions, Jane and Russell would like you to raise your hand via Zoom, and we'll call on you and unmute you so you can ask your question as we go.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go over the agenda and the expectations for today. And up front, we want everyone to know that this will be a collaborative workshop. We're hoping to foster conversation and an exchange of ideas. And we'd like to spend more time speaking with you than speaking to you. The English co-requisite model, it's new, which means that there will be particular challenges in launching an assessment plan for it, perhaps on top of other assessment challenges at our institutions. However, I have no doubt that some of you also have successful assessment strategies and processes, and that's a balance that we're looking to strike during our time together today, adapting what works now for your current assessments, adapting what works from your colleagues and that we hear about today, and then designing new assessments when necessary. Along the way, if Jane and I can answer questions for you, we certainly will, and we'll humbly do so. But our intent is to host a forum in which we can learn from each other. We'll start today by reviewing some contextual points about assessment in the co-rec model itself. And then, as Brandon said earlier, we're going to collaborate via 2 breakout sessions, one for assessment planning, and then the other for doing the actual assessment. And then we'll have a group discussion on post-assessment strategies for analysis and reporting. And throughout that portion of the agenda, we're going to be working in breakout rooms, coming back to have discussions as an entire group. And we've provided you with a handout. It's a planning tool. I posted it in a chat box, but I know a few of you signed on just after I did. So I'll repost that in just a couple of minutes. Now we're going to return to that handout throughout this workshop, but note for now that the first couple of pages have a series of prompts and questions, and these are aligned with the breakout discussions and the slides that you're going to see, the things that Jane and I will say. But feel free to use them, of course, at any time to take notes, jot down responses, reflections, takeaways, anything that would help you strategize both today and beyond. One more quick note about that, the last couple of pages of that handout have more granular questions and prompts that you can review after the workshop as you continue your assessment work later on. So our objective is to prepare you to design and implement an assessment plan for your co-requisite model based on your current assessments, as I said, based on strategies that we'll discuss as a group today. And so that planning document, the handout, is partly intended as your written record of our collaboration today, and partly intended as a document that you can use for your work ahead. And then finally, at the end of our time together, we're going to save some time for any final reflections, questions, and open discussion that you may want to have. But Jane and I want to remind you that we're here to help you beyond these 2 hours today. As Brandon said, we're all colleagues in the same system here, and we're going to encourage you to contact us whenever you'd like to discuss assessment of the co-rec model. So Brandon, I think given the number of people, if I could ask you to skip past the next slide and then move to, yes, thank you, to the setting of context. All right, and I'm going to take just a few more minutes to set the context as the slide suggests. Just like teaching and learning, assessment and the goals of assessment, they can be institution specific, discipline specific, but I'm going to reference a few common themes that you'll hear in this workshop. And these are themes that we see as particularly relevant to the English co-requisite model. First, the concept that learning opportunities are complementary, can be complementary. Over the past 20 years or so, there's been quite a bit of scholarship of student learning has suggested that the student experience exists in holistic terms, which really just means there's an alignment or a scaffolding of learning across, say, curricular and co-curricular, or between gen ed and the major, or between classroom learning and high impact learning situated in so-called real world experiences. I think, however, there's still a general tendency to describe the educational experience as strictly sequential or based wholly on credits and requirements. But in fact, that concept of complementary learning brings us back to think about how students hone certain competencies over time across a variety of experiences and how we foster simultaneous learning. So naturally, a co-requisite model works in a similar fashion. And we might think about this type of learning and the learning outcomes that support it, and then the assessment that we're gonna discuss today. Second, we encourage you to think about a schedule for assessment, which would be a crucial component of sustainable assessment, a phrase I find myself using very often here at UNR. Degree granting programs, they often ask me if they need to assess everything all the time. And the answer is often no, or at least not everything through direct assessment all the time. You know, looking over your SLOs, and we'll do this in the exercises, think about what's accessible, what's measurable. And we hope that everything is measurable, but what can be practically assessed? Which outcomes can be paired or grouped to make assessment effective over a schedule of semesters, years, ultimately over a cycle that can be sustained. And we also encourage you rather to think about what meaningful assessment would accomplish for you. What would the goals of your assessment be? You know, meaningful is going to have different connotations for different offices, programs, for different institutions. It's often informed by local context. a lot of us these days, I'm sure a lot of you on this call, we're paying particular attention to at-risk populations. And so in student success assessments, meaningful is often framed in terms of addressing potential equity gaps at the institutional level. But in student learning assessment that we're focusing on today, you might have multiple levels that help us define what meaningful is and help us establish goals. In classroom settings, you may have in mind assessment that would help your students reach a balance between what they do well in areas where they need improvement. At a program level, meaningful assessment, it's often aimed at measuring student preparation, perhaps for key courses or life beyond graduation. And at an institutional level, learning outcomes assessment has to roll up those perspectives to form some summative evaluation. And that, we hope, meaningful evaluation will likely draw from common learning expectations, including the one that we're discussing today, this co-requisite model and other gen ed writing requirements, and often looks at a common final requirement for us here at UNR that's a capstone. So consider throughout today what meaningful assessment would produce for your respective co-requisite models at your institution. And finally, a quick note on terminology. During the sessions and later on, we're going to use the term artifacts today. You'll see that in the handout as well. By that term artifacts, we mean student work, papers, exams, and so on, things that are collected and evaluated for assessment. So just keep that in mind for later. And Jane, Brandon, if we could advance a slide, and Jane, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to repost the handout.
Okay. In the development of the NSHE co-requisite writing course, the task force charged with designing and planning implementation of these courses articulated these overarching objectives. These are derived from the course outcomes that all our institutions had in common for gateway or first college level courses like English 101. Since we on the task force did not want to wade into the SLO level detail in all our curricula, the overarching objectives are pretty general. But the curricular details out of each of our institutions would fall under these categories. Rhetorical knowledge, that would be the ability to identify, define for composing purposes and address effectively audience, context, purpose. Critical thinking, reading and composing, or the ability to engage with other writers' texts, use information effectively and integrate the ideas of others into your own. Processes, or the ability to understand the diverse and varied social and individual processes at play in writing, like invention, drafting, revising, editing, etc. Conventions, the ability to understand and deploy knowledge of larger scale forms like genres, down to the nitty-gritty of standard usage expected in academic contexts. Also, and it's kind of highlighted down there in the bottom, also, the task force singled out for special attention and emphasis based on what research statistics and teaching experience over recent years have taught us about students whose placement falls into the co-requisite placement range. Co-requisite support would emphasize critical reading support to focus on both work with texts of others and, importantly, students work with their own texts as they composed and revised. Brandon, would you switch to slide 11? And Russell.
Thank you, Jane. So if I could ask everyone to open the handout if you haven't done so already, and you'll see that there is a section entitled Pre-Assessment Planning that's matched to the slide that we have as well. This section has a series of questions for the first breakout room. These are questions that will ask you to consider a starting point for designing or adapting an assessment strategy for your co-requisite model. And so in preparation for this first breakout session, just a couple of remarks. We're going to focus on a couple of objectives. First, asking you to identify your co-requisite SLOs. As we've suggested already, identifying SLOs that align, say, your support component of the co-req model with your gateway English course. It's a helpful starting point in assessment design because from the student's perspective, these outcomes articulate what they are expected both to develop within that co-req model and demonstrate upon completing it. But from your perspective, as faculty, as administrators, as evaluators, complementary SLOs, these co-rec SLOs, they can yield more impactful assessment data, primarily because you can use them, you can leverage them to both measure formative and summative performance during the model and at the end of the model on outcomes that students will need to demonstrate, likely on multiple occasions. In other words, rather than assessing SLOs in isolation, you can use assessment of these types of outcomes that are introduced into co-rec support or the lab component, developed at the gateway level, perhaps even further developed beyond the gateway. And so you can conduct an assessment that serves multiple purposes. The second objective is to identify assets and challenges. Now, this can include assessment tools, it could be resources, it could be campus partners. I'm sure you have other things in mind. My hope is that no one has to build an assessment plan from scratch for the co-rec model, but if you do, we're certainly here to help. So think about what exists at your institution or in your program that you can borrow or adapt. And it may be obvious. It could be current assessments of gen ed writing, for example, but it may not be. What conversations are going on about teaching and learning or about writing specifically, about student success, software, is it available? Can institutional analysis or research support your data needs? So in the breakout rooms, discuss with each other what you can adapt or modify from your current assessments and your current situations, and share those ideas with each other. I also want to say that for the first breakout session, everyone will be assigned to a room arranged by your home institution. So we're going to ask that task force leads, that institution leads, help manage the conversation in their respect out rooms. And when you are assigned to your room, take just a few moments to quickly get to know each other institutionally, so to speak, as far as assessment is concerned. And so that we can quickly get to the collaborative portion, we're asking that one person from each institution, please identify yourselves as the lead contact on assessment, if we have that person. Introduce any colleagues from your home institution. And then in just a few sentences, describe how you currently assess your Gateway first year writing course. Treat this like an elevator speech, right? We've all been trained to talk about our job experience, our responsibilities, and our research and so on in a very brief 1-minute elevator speech. And then after you do those introductions, just refer back to the pre-assessment planning section of that worksheet. Look at the series of questions that we have, and we'd like for you to answer these together, working as a group based on the respective situations at your home institutions. But of course, you can also take notes, and we encourage you to do so, to take notes of ideas from others in a breakout session. And if you can't answer a question, that's perfectly fine. Just use the question as an opportunity to sketch out ideas that come to mind during the conversation with the others in the room. And remember that we're going to be using your responses on this worksheet throughout today's workshop. But again, we also want you to have something that you can take home to help with strategizing for next steps. And Brandon, I believe that if need be, the participants can come out of the break rooms to ask questions of us. But I will tell you that at 10 minutes after we assign you to your room, Jane and I will start to make our rounds, if you will, through the rooms just to check in. And we're going to give up to 20 minutes for you all to work on this portion. Jane, is there anything that you want to add before we assign everyone to their rooms?
No, thank you.
Okay, so Brandon, could I ask you please to assign everyone to your room?
All right,
Okay.
is everybody's back?
Looks like everyone's coming back. So we're gonna take about 10 minutes here just to hear from you, to hear the takeaways from some of your conversations before we move on to the next session. So were you all able, first of all, to identify a couple of co-requisite SLOs? And you can feel free to unmute yourselves to provide feedback. You can use the chat box if you prefer. Silence is tough to read, so we need someone, especially on Zoom.
I'll go ahead and share. So as I shared this with Russell, but we're using the exact same SLOs for 100 and 101. So we don't have distinction. And then at NSC, they're still working on those. So we actually kind of spent quite a time work, not quite getting at individual outcomes, but sort of talking about the process we were going through. So that's sort of where our group was.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Well, I'll speak up. That at UNLV, we actually are embedding these students in the same 101 classes as the students who are not co-requisite. So of course the gateway course SLOs will not change, but we have identified SLOs for the labs that are built from those, looking at critical reading and rhetorical understanding and genre support, and what are those areas that we need to emphasize in the labs in order to support students.
Yeah, thank you. Could I ask the group as well, with that first question in mind, were you able to anticipate, or maybe you know already from experience, what might be the most meaningful SLOs or most meaningful for the assessment that we're starting with this co-requisite model?
For us, Russell, in our group, both with UNLV and UNR, we really talked about how important the reading was, and being able to assess that. What was really interesting is UNLV, and they're using that same model where they're going to have the students in 101 and then have the 2 labs. So there was a really interesting conversation that was happening right at the end about if you had a different, if they weren't in the regular 101, then they would have maybe a slowed down version. So assessing those students before they've really gotten the support from the lab, or that it's just an interesting conversation about if students are embedded in a 101 or 100 with other students who aren't in the kind of co-rec element, how does that assessment play out, and the importance of the reading one specifically.
Jane, I know you had called attention to that, to critical reading. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I was just, did you come up with anything that you thought would be a good site or moment in the class or material to collect, student artifacts? Did you get that far, or were you just to the point of identifying, oh, okay, this would be an area, we've done assessment of this before, how could we go about it for this? And is it any different when it's a co-requisite versus when it's just a regular 101 that you might be assessing?
I don't think that we got to picking a specific, that we were talking about like how many documents there could be. So I think it was just like, how do you pick? So I think we were just emerging on that conversation in our group.
Yeah, but we did talk about that reflective writing could be an element of that.
Okay, that would be a way.
Yeah, our group, as I said, NSC, we're still working on revising. We have a boot camp, a 6-week boot camp planned over the summer to revise our learning outcomes, create our assessment models, curriculum, that kind of thing. So, we have a plan. It's just we haven't gotten there yet. But in terms of just like my experience with outcomes assessment, and even for composition courses, one of the things you have to really think about is how are you going to evaluate progress, because that's what we really want to show, right? We want to show that a student comes in at the beginning, that they've made progress in terms of all of the outcomes by the end. So when we have done some composition assessment before, we've actually done more of a portfolio as opposed to a single artifact. And so, we picked several outcomes, but we wanted to see, like, does the student improve? Particularly because we're doing it in our 101 course, which is our 100, which is our 101 built with support in it already. It's 5 credits. So it's one of those where it's like, how are students, improving through instruction, scaffolding, all of those things, that then we can assess the learning outcomes at the end based on what we've seen from the beginning.
Yep, those are absolutely the challenges.
That's right.
Russell, did you have any other thoughts or questions?
Yeah, I am curious in response to those remarks that we were asking you in the questions as well about, you mentioned a number of artifacts. Some of you, are you aiming or have you aimed looking at a single artifact to try to get at a summative assessment, or in a co-rec model, having multiple assessments, and that's a portfolio approach that you were just mentioning. So anybody else have any?
Yeah, Russell and Jane, Todd is raising his hand, so I'll ask him to unmute. And I also just want to point, Robin Road has written a comment in the chat about using midterm portfolios and final portfolios in her class, and uses Canvas learning outcomes tools to assess each learning outcome. Reading has been an interesting thing to try to assess in a portfolio. Don't think we have it down yet. And go ahead, Todd.
Yeah, I was just curious about if you had information on like what our institutions and our accreditation body have, like in terms of kind of indirect versus direct assessment materials. I think about student reflections. They're good if you have an SLO explicitly focused on reflection. Like that could be a direct measure for that. But then like in general, like I don't see reflection's good insight, but it's like more of an indirect measure. Like if a student's saying they feel confident on this, same thing if we were to add questions to like evaluations. And so like what kind of balance do you see between kind of those more direct measures and then indirect measures in terms of the assessment that we should be doing and planning?
So I think we can only speak to an institutional level. Jane, do you want to start, or do you want me to start that answer?
Well, when I've done assessment myself, I've always erred on the side of collecting and doing direct assessment, so doing portfolio assessments. And I didn't ever do something like a reflective essay, although they were included. We also had difficulty getting at reading. We could get at it by a shared summary assignment. And that got us into all kinds of down in the weeds about how to constrain that, so that the way we were looking at the same things. We also looked intensively at how students were able to use, so how they were able to use the ideas of others. So how well did they do integrating sources in, which is kind of it's been more of an issue with English 102, which makes sense. But that was one of the two places that we were able to kind of look at reading, but we didn't rely very heavily at all on the indirect measures.
And Todd, you mentioned accreditation. I'll say quickly here, I know a few of us, including myself, are ALOs, and of course we're all covered by the same regional accrediting body. They're not prescriptive when it comes to general education assessment. That's why I think we keep coming back to that theme of meaningful for you. That seems to be the overarching prescription, if you even want to call it that. That being said, I do think that, we'll talk about this in the reporting part, but if you use indirect, we have occasionally within our gen ed, but not necessarily consistently. If you do, weave in some student feedback for indirect questions about assignments or course content, for example, as well as using reflective assignments, as you suggested earlier, and then doing a more direct assessment of student work, as we were discussing just a few minutes ago. Certainly that balance is always good for the readership, but there is no expectation, at least from our accreditors, nor from our institution. I'm speaking only for the three of us, and Maureen and some of the others who are representing UNR, that we achieve that balance, but it is an option.
Thank you, that's good. Yeah, my old institution, our director was very prescriptive on like how many direct measures and indirect measures they wanted. So it was not working very well, and created a lot of bad blood around assessment.
Understood. No, I think we all figure it out together, and I think that's one of the values of doing this in the same system. So Jane, our time is up for this segment.
Okay.
And Brandon, if I could ask you, if I missed a question, please use the chat, and then I can respond to it via chat even. But Brandon, if I could ask you to advance to the next slide, we're going to get ready for the second breakout session. Thank
Is
you.
this where you want me to be on assessment?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. As we've been discussing your insights from that first breakout session, we'll need to confront the challenge of collecting and analyzing some concrete products or manifestations of student performance. And some of the co-requisite course outcomes can present particular challenges on the collecting side, on top of the usual logistical logjams or resource scarcity problems we all know too well. In analysis, you want to arrive at meaningful, useful insights with which you can revise and continue building this new curriculum and making its delivery as effective as possible for students. In the next breakout session, your workshopping will be guided through a series of questions that invite you to draft solutions to a number of practical puzzles we all confront in conducting assessment. For your SLOs, selected SLOs, what is the best student artifact to collect? We want something valid and measurable, a product or performance. How will you collect this material, prepare it for evaluation, store it, deliver it to your evaluators? That's the logistical problem. How will you evaluate it? Are your evaluators trained? Are they measuring and scoring the performances consistently over time and with each other? How will you verify and store the results of the scoring? Are your results trustworthy, meaningful, and useful? So those are the kinds of questions that you're going to work on in the next section of the worksheet. And with that, I can ask Brandon to put us into the breakout rooms, and you'll have probably 15 minutes. Is that what we said, Russell?
Yeah, 15 to 20.
So we wanted to take a few minutes to talk over as a full group some of your findings from your discussions in your breakout rooms. So I just have a few questions, but if you have questions that you would like to get discussed, please go ahead and raise your hand. But anyway, so we want to know, what thorny issues were you able to resolve, and maybe what issues remain thorny? Maybe we can talk about them in the whole group.
I would say what remained thorny for our group was that we have so much freedom in the curriculum at NSC that there's not a standardized sort of assignment or assessment. Especially we were talking about in terms of trying to assess reading and looking at summaries, but we don't have any common readings across the course necessarily, because everyone does have the freedom to choose their own readings and what kind of writing assignments they're going to do.
Yes, this is something that we've confronted in the past in assessment projects. Joanna? You're muted.
I know, I got
okay.
To piggyback off of what Kelly was saying, yeah, this is one of the things that came up, is like we tend to in assessment default to an essay because at least that's a common artifact, right? That a composition class will have an essay at some point, but at NSC we like to encourage, different kinds of essay writing. So testimonio, navigational logs, there's multimodal projects, there's a lot of variation. And so, especially in 100 and 101, as you're building towards your research-based writing in 102. So it's kind of like how we'll have to kind of put our heads together and noodle like what we would potentially do as a project or a reading or something to assess. Like I feel like we'd be good on coming up with shared learning outcomes. It's then how do we create an artifact to assess those in a formal way that I think is going to be our challenge.
Well, and a measurement tool. I mean, part of your challenge is coming up with a way that that can, a tool that can encompass a variety of different things if that's what you're going to be presented with. Those are, yeah, those are tough issues, and it looks like you have a few more items for your boot camp.
Yeah, and I'll say, Kelly and Joanne, in response to both your remarks, that I spent a lot of time negotiating with faculty about what to pick for assessment that won't step on their toes for that freedom of assignment designation or assignment design. For what it's worth, I always come back to the outcomes and to the tools that they end up selecting. You know, can we find a similarity across your assignments and something that more tightly aligns with the outcome, of course, and with the tool, which is aligned with the outcome in turn. But I know that can be a tedious conversation, but I don't want to impose across sections or across courses what the assignment is, of course, nor do I want to impose what we pick for the assessment. That really has to be up to them, but that seems always to be the negotiating point.
Anybody have other thorny issues or other topics that you'd like to discuss based on your work in the breakout sessions? Okay. Russell, do you want to make a transition?
Sure, yeah, we can move forward with Brandon. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, so for the third, this won't be a breakout session. This is something we're going to do together as a larger group, but we're still going to reference the handout. So on the handout, there is a section entitled Analysis and Reporting Group Discussion. And we do have some questions that we want to use to drive that discussion. And I'm just going to give a few remarks before we hand the conversation over to everybody. This area, it's difficult to forecast what your experience is. In my experience, I spend a lot of time, it seems, talking with faculty about the planning phase and the analysis and reporting phase, which are often the two that we place into that scale. I often spend a lot of time talking about closing the loop. Closing the loop is a commonly used phrase, and it's a common challenge. But when we're reviewing assessment results after the project, I understand it can be difficult to find a foothold. I personally find it helpful, but you may as well, to review the results based on my own experience in my own position. And so I asked myself as a former instructor and in my role now, what stands out about the aggregate results? And you might think too, just for your own sake, what format would you need them presented in to engage with them? And if you showed them to colleagues, in turn, what stands out to them initially? And what format would they need? And I want to share just a couple of brief examples from you and our faculty and how they reacted to aggregate results. These were both gen ed assessments. One was in a STEM field and another was in the humanities department here at UNR. In the STEM assessment, a program embedded a similar but identical, identical, but it's not identical, but similar set of questions in exams that they administered across sections of a course. And those questions were aligned with the 3 SLOs of the course. And when the faculty conducted the assessment, they looked over the results, they saw immediately that students had begun to struggle with the second set of questions, and then their performance really dropped off with the third set of questions. And they realized, as instructors and assessors, they realized that they had designed the SLOs as a set of hurdles. In other words, students had to master completely that first set of SLO, or the first SLO, to grasp the second. And then again, they had to master the second one in order to proceed to the third. So the faculty had inadvertently created this high stakes scenario where there was no time for intervention, and students needed support for either the first or the second SLO. And so faculty were able very quickly to use the results or their interpretation of the results to revise the course and to build in time for more assessments and time for more interventions as needed. And then in the humanities department, same thing, a faculty committee, assessment committee, they oversaw the assessment of student writing. It was based on 4 competencies that the committee thought was this ubiquitous across their curriculum. And the 4th of their competencies for writing was to raise or anticipate a counter argument in writing a position paper, something I think a lot of them do in Gen Ed as well. And when the assessment was over and faculty reviewed the results for all 4 outcomes in the rubric, they saw that most of their evaluators had marked NA for that 4th competency. It wasn't that the students were unable to do it, they weren't asked to do it at all, and that was the disconnect. So faculty on one end were assuming that this competency was taught from day 1 in the program, but then when they went through the assessment and looked at the student work, they found out that that wasn't the case at all. But again, they had a very easy target, a very easy objective in front of them for how to revise courses. And in that case, they were also revising the programs. But the point I want to make with those anecdotes, and I draw on those often, is that reviewing assessment results, they can begin with these group discussions among instructors, those who know the work best and the assignments and the students best. And in neither one of those cases did those groups have to rely on a thorough statistical analysis of the results. It would have taken time and resources, but they didn't need it because their assessments were geared towards practical classroom-based outcomes. And so as instructors, as I said, they recognized immediately what to do with their results. It was just a revision of assignments and of courses, and in some cases of the program. And I'll say too that in many of the assessment projects of which I've been a part, a few other questions have come up during that counterbalancing, I think ultimately of both the planning and the analysis and reporting stage. And we can return to these topics if you wish, but I frame these as questions that, let's say, they're behind the questions that are on the handout. One, as we mentioned earlier, have we collected and evaluated enough artifacts to justify an interpretation beyond anecdotal? And that's why sampling is important, of course. 2, do you want or do you need to disaggregate your results? This does come up from time to time, and so I don't want to get into the details of it, but I'll give everyone the same caveat that I give our faculty. If you evaluate anonymized student work, which we advise, we understand it's not always practical, but we do advise it. If you do that, just make sure that you can tie the results back to a name, and in our cases, to an NCHI ID, because that gives you access to the enrollment records. It also gives you access to academic and other data points, should you choose to use them. And then 3, can you tie the reporting and the analysis to other institutional assessments? So in my case, I look at who's tracking DFWI rates in gateway courses. That's a big topic right now, and I know that we have individuals doing that. This is a sort of assessment project that, in my opinion, could very well complement that sort of work, as it could other learning assessments within your gen ed curricula. And then I ask yourself, with those potential partners, could those projects inform each other, or at the very least, could they share your findings, both for you and for them, and then for your university or your institutional leadership? Finally, we come back to a question that's on the handout. Who are your stakeholders and readerships? In most cases, we share the same campus community, although those will be different internal stakeholders. NC, of course, regional accreditation, as was asked earlier, potentially even for some of these gateway and co-rec assessments, potentially even employers. So when your assessment project is complete, what are those groups going to be looking for? And even if we can't answer that question for every audience or for every stakeholder, I do think we can be prepared to document every step of the project. That's always going to be an important part of reporting. And then we can always keep in mind what could be and what are the common takeaways of assessment. And that might include evidence of learning, evidence of effective teaching, or even innovative teaching, if you want to use that adjective. But what I really mean is teaching that's responsive to student needs. There are a lot of conversations about that as well. And then, of course, this improvement of student performance, which came up in one of your remarks earlier today. And just remembering that a genuine assessment of student learning, it just considers if improvement can be made, if improvement should be made. And there are a lot of possibilities for doing that. So what I'd like to do with those questions in mind.
Russell, before you do that, can I just add, there was a question in the chat.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, thanks, Brandon. Sure.
Because before you transition, which is how much should we or do we factor in qualitative assessment findings as well?
So Jane, if you can jump in on this too, of course, but in my experience here, we typically don't get too deep into qualitative assessments, but we do, of course, rely on commentary for interpretation, qualitative commentary for interpretation. The reason being is that we're just not set up, if I think about surveying students, focus groups, things like this, we typically do that for student success, and especially for issues such as inclusivity. And we do that for underrepresented students, for example, or first generation, I think even for commuter students. For student learning, we have not taken that approach just because, I mean, to speak frankly, that puts a lot of time on faculty and on ourselves. So we fall back initially to an assessment that can give us quantitative results, and then spend our time digging into those results when necessary, and then spend our time too, as I'm saying, reporting, just delivering a report that justifies, that goes over the interpretations, that justifies actions taken, and then always frames that with, when I always call it human interest, framing that within our actual students, framing that within our courses, framing that within our mode of instruction, and so on. Okay.
I would just add to that that when I've done assessment projects, and I've used both quantitative and qualitative data that was derived from the assessment in reporting. But what I tried to do was to come up with versions of the report that were addressed to specific stakeholders. And so, you know, of course, the numbers were interesting and useful to the instructors, for example, as they're going through curriculum reform or revision, or they're wanting to change their assignments or something like that. So sometimes, not always, they wanted to jump right away from the numbers. They used the numbers as sort of a broad indication of something, but they really wanted to jump into the qualitative information versus what I reported to the general education, to the core board and the general education group. That was much more, it had much more of the you know, tables of numbers, you know, and the statistical analysis and discussion about that, using that for interpretation and making cases that were very different to that group than to what the teachers were doing. So if you think of, that's where, to go back to what Russell was saying about the variety of stakeholders that you're addressing this to, that could be a way to make decisions about how much of what you're going to collect and then how you're going to present it.
Todd, I see your hand is up as well.
Yeah, I wanted to just talk a little more about like the labor involved in, you know, getting meaningful numbers, and like, you know, thinking about, like, we have, let's see, five, you know, we have 5 different classes. You know, each class has, you know, so many outcomes to it, you know, and you know, we have, say, you know, a couple thousand students in our classes in a given semester. And so, you know, just thinking about, like, do you have any kind of thoughts on, like, you know, like focusing on this, like this co-requisite initiative, like our labor for the next few years, as opposed to trying to assess, you know, classes that we've been teaching for a while, like, you know, so we can really get some meaningful information from that. Because otherwise, like, you know, we pull 10 students from here, 10 students from this class, 10 students from that class, like it, you know, just kind of becomes, you know, I don't know, it has felt like a meaningless exercise, I guess, you know, when I've kind of taken part in some of these before, because it's just such a small grouping of that. And so I don't know, it's just a little more thoughts maybe on how do we balance all this out, because yeah, you know, even if we're generating quantitative data with rubrics, like faculty with writing have to read that, right? So we're talking about, you know, hours of work for each faculty member involved in that assessment if they're reading, you know, 20, 30, 40, 50, you know, student samples, portfolios, or whatever.
Yeah, you know, that's a great question. Thanks for asking that. And that's, you know, it's one of these questions that's always lurking behind all 3 of the phases that we've talked about. So I'm going to say a couple of things, and then and Jane, I'll ask you to jump in as well. In most of what I would say major in quotation marks, meaning assessment of an institutional wide experience. So usually a gen ed, and then in this case, a couple of writing assessments that I have in mind. I have always ended up with, if it's a summative assessment, drawing one artifact per student. We've always ended up as something between 300 and 400 artifacts. But resources depending, that's something that we've done, at least when I've been involved in it, and then Jane can speak to core writing, something that we've done as more of a retreat, towards the end of the semester. And so there are other resources that have to be considered for that. One of the topics that came up earlier, one of the remarks that came up earlier in a co-rec model, and I think that this is something that could be more instructor-based, is how to get immediate feedback, either through assessment of student artifacts or this through check-ins with the instructors, to try to get more of a formative sense throughout the term, throughout the semester, and throughout the students' time in class. That could take away from the burden of having 300 to 400 artifacts at the end of a semester. But it may also take you away from that distance rating, right? Instead of having other people look at it, you may just have instructors looking at their own. But that's how I've approached it, as one of two alternatives. I know you had a couple of other questions folded in there. And before I come back to that, Jane, did you have anything you wanted to add to that initial topic?
Well, with our portfolio assessments, we just decided, because Russell's predecessor was not willing or not able to give me a sample size that was going to be useful. But what I did was I just said, okay, we want to collect between 10 to 15%. And it wound up being 5 from each class. And we did a random number generator and we picked 5 from each class. And then is the whole logistical nightmare of getting those from the instructor. The instructor collected them and we copied them, and we had to anonymize them and things like that. But is that getting at your question, Todd? I'm not sure. I mean, that's just to add what Russell was saying, is that, when you want to do that kind of a study where you're really wanting to look at the role of that particular course in a program, that's how we did it. That's not necessarily the only way to do it.
And I'll say too, you asked about, I believe you asked about sampling, so I want to get in a quick point there for the group. In those, use the word again, those university-wide assessments that I've done, I have not just asked for random students. I typically try to curate that sampling so that the student work, the student artifacts that we're pulling, that they represent the student cohort or the student body. Now, and again, when we're talking about gen ed of any kind, but particularly about gen ed writing and gen ed math, and I suppose core humanities, because all students have to pass through the same sorts of classes at our institutions, you could make the argument that the sampling is going to represent your entire student body. But that's what I always strive for as well, so that, and I just tell faculty, you're not conducting random assessment. You're really, because you want to get something out of this assessment that speaks to your needs and to your students' needs, not to just, and this is probably more for program assessment, but not for students who you'll never see again. Right, because the whole point of this, I think, or one of the points of it, is to follow that student progression on outcomes that they're going to encounter throughout their time at your institution. So you can be very deliberate about sampling, not just in the numbers, but in the students as well. So I didn't want to cut you off, but I just remembered when Jane was talking that you asked about that.
Yeah, and based on something you said a little bit earlier in response to my question, it reminded me of, I think it was physics faculty at my old institution. They did like these instructor reports, and there was some like back and forth on whether these were direct measures or indirect measures. But the department found them really useful. Like sometimes I feel like just having like the instructors use a rubric, without any kind of norming, like to generate some numbers, in different SLOs in terms of competency can have limited effectiveness, but maybe ongoing instructor reports from how they perceive their students, are there particular outcomes that they're, doing really well on, what they're not doing really well on would be a way maybe to collect that information, because they're, they know their students the best, and can kind of, get a sense of that project. That would complement maybe a smaller scale portfolio reading or something like that. Just a way to kind of think about getting more useful information without just kind of adding to numbers of, papers that we're doing in, a rubric assessment session.
That's right. Yeah, and it gives you another approach, as you said, that's complementary to the other things that you're doing. Okay. Any other questions before we give you a couple of minutes to look at the handout? Okay, so let's take about this 3 minutes or so. If we could ask you to look over the questions on the handout under that third section, analysis and reporting. This is probably just jotting down notes. Again, I don't know your level of experience with this, and we're not going to do breakout rooms. Just take 3 minutes, look at it yourself, and then we're going to come back to discuss any questions about that topic or any overall questions about today's time together. Okay, so Jane, I think we're ready to open it back up. So what we thought we would do, we've got about 8 minutes or so before we hand it back over to Brandon. So we've got a little bit of time here. If there's any question or comment, suggestion that you want to raise, it can be specifically about the analysis and reporting section, as we just talked about with Todd, or if you have questions that you want to ask just in general about the topics that we've covered today or anything else about assessing the English co-requisite model. So the floor is yours. And I'm watching Zoom, so if you use the chat feature, Brandon, I'm looking at that as well.
Russell, can you drop the handout into the chat one more time?
I can.
I'm just wondering if there'll be any opportunities for all of us as an NCHE kind of group to maybe get back together once we've done these assessments and kind of look at this collectively, because I think this is very interesting. We all kind of have slightly different models. I think, you know, with this kind of encouragement of us picking what's going to be most useful to us, we may be assessing different SLOs or things like that. What we choose as our artifacts may be different. I think it could be a real learning opportunity if we could come back together in the future to really compare what we did, what we learned, and kind of look at this as a larger group. So I hope we get a chance to do that.
I second that. Thanks, Maureen. I love the idea. Yeah, as I said at the beginning, you know, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, and then we can help coordinate to get everyone just checking in with each other, which is important anyway during these circumstances. But I agree that because this is new, it would be really valuable for us to see how we're all faring.
Russell, two things. One is because I don't work for NCHE, I'm going to say the answer to that, Maureen, is absolutely yes. It just takes a little bit of leadership, because one of the things that we've seen across SPD is some of the sharing across institutions. And while that may not be a direct outcome, I think it's a really important indirect outcome. So it just takes someone saying, let's get this together so it doesn't fall by the wayside. So I would love to task someone, but maybe Renee can help figure out who that would be good to do to continue in the future. Of course, I am looking at Jane and Russell. I also want to point out that Maria, hopefully I'm pronouncing your name correctly, has her hand up with the comment.
That's Elaine.
Yeah.
Yeah, somehow I became Maria, and I don't know how that happened. I mean, I love Marilla. She's a great scholar, so yay for me. But I just also want to, I appreciate Maureen bringing it up, because actually that is part of our action plan, is that we gave us time for development of the co-requisite before we do official reports, but we did want to check in with each other on an interim basis in order to share ideas. Because again, we have such a great team of people across the state that we do want to benefit from that. So thank you for the reminder.
Communities of practice are powerful.
Yeah, Ben, in our office, the system office is always happy to facilitate these types of things. I do this a lot on the student affairs side, where I bring together the financial aid directors and the registrars. So there's no reason we can't assist where our help would be, would be desired. We don't have to be involved if you guys do it on your own, but certainly we can help provide some support and structure to, setting up meetings and that type of thing.
Thank you very much, Renee. Appreciate that. Is there anything else? Any other questions or comments? The 4 o'clock lull is upon us. Okay.
Russell and Jane, I'm sharing the screen again.
Okay.
I think people know how to get a hold of you, but I want to make sure to share that with.
Yeah.
Okay. So you'll indulge me one last time as a writing teacher, and just take a minute, take a deep breath, and write just a couple sentences reflecting on your experience today. If there's 1 or 2 salient insights that you had that you don't want to forget, or questions that you still have, this is a moment. We're just going to give you a couple minutes. Would you please just take a minute and write that down? And then Brandon will rustle us back up because he has some items he wants us to do.
Well, I'll just drop them right now into the chat, which is, you can click on the link now. You don't need to do it this second, but your feedback is important. So we would love for you to take just a few minutes to complete an evaluation of today's session. I've also put a link to the NCHE site, which has lots of great information. And I also dropped a document that has a flyer for the upcoming as well as the past professional development. And the reason why we say both upcoming and past is because we have been recording these for you and your colleagues to be able to watch. We have another great session tomorrow on students, providing access to students with disabilities, and we have some more coming up in April. Stay tuned because we're going to be adding an online for the co-rec part 2. So that's my part, and I can let Jane and Russell close things up.
Jane, did you want to still give everyone a minute or two to write their final reflections?
They must have been doing it, or maybe they've been paying attention to Brandon.
Or both. We're multitasking. Okay. Well, are you ready to wrap it up?
Oh, sure.
I have one more thing to say, which I would be neglectful if I didn't say thank you to Jane and thank you to Russell. They take this seriously, and I can tell you that from their preparation, from the way that they've presented their thoughtfulness and the breakouts, as well as information and guiding, not giving here is the answer, but really guiding the discussion and the thought that needs to go with this. So big thank you to Jane and to Russell.
Well, thank you, Brandon, and thank you everyone for your time today. And we will certainly take this suggestion to heart. Maureen, I think you've started a little grassroots movement here. We hope to see you in the future. I do agree that we've got a lot to learn from each other.
With that, thank you everyone for attending, and enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you all.
Thank you.